Kia ora and welcome to Mana Talanoa. I'm Andre Whitaker, and today's session is our Wahine Toa Women in Sport, and it's my pleasure to welcome a real Wahine Toa into this series and this discussion. This person's taken part and played basketball for New Zealand for the Tall Ferns at international level, contracted overseas to play in the first women's NBA series, and actually has been to 2 Olympic Games. So fantastic sport background, and it's a pleasure to welcome Megan Compain. Kia ora, Megan.
Kia ora, Andre. Talo Falafa and Bulavanaka.
Yeah. Look, what a great start. Like you've got a fascinating sports background, but equally fascinating is your family heritage stretching from Aotearoa across New Zealand to the Pacific, to the US and across to France. So let's start there with your family heritage. Yeah,
it is a bit of a shame, as that's probably about all of the language that I can instill on you, because I didn't grow up with the language being spoken around me, which is as you get older that becomes much more of an interest point, I guess, to point back to your roots is to start with language. And I wish we had heard it more. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, could speak 4 or 5 different languages, all the Pacific Island languages. She understood French, which is just incredible. But for her, prestige was to speak English, so she always spoke English to us and spoke English at home. So yeah, it's a shame, and I wish that we could go back in time and be, as enlightened as we are when we're a little bit older, when we're a little bit younger, and tell her to impart that knowledge on us. So, but yeah, so it's a bit hard to know where to start with my cultural background and heritage. So. I can start at the beginning. So my mother is European English, and my father, although to look at him you would think he was straight off the boat, Pacific Island, he's actually half French as well. So the dark colour definitely pulls through. So to my dad's generation, and certainly to our generation, even though we're 3/4 Pākehā European. So, but my dad's side of the heritage and family history and lineage is what's quite fascinating. It starts in Fiji, where he was born, but and that's probably the Pacific Island that our family identifies most with, because Dad was born there, raised there, came to New Zealand as a 15-year-old with 8 brothers and sisters. My grandmother was born in Fiji, but there's not an ounce of Fijian blood in us. So that was always the misconception growing up. We just assumed we were Fijian, but we weren't. My grandmother was actually born to my great-grandmother was Tahitian Samoan. And the Samoan was hidden from us for quite a long time. And you can only ask a Fijian why that would be. And her father was actually, so my great-grandfather was an African-American, and he was a merchant marine traveling through the Pacific Islands, met my great-grandmother living in Samoa as a 16-year-old. They had a very interesting meeting as a young person, and she ended up pregnant, and the family sent her to Fiji to live with relatives and have the baby outside of the family. So she was disowned basically and sent away, and that was my grandmother. So my great-grandfather, who's African-American, can trace their roots right back to the first one of the first slaves of Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if you've heard the story of Sally Hemings, who was Thomas Jefferson's slave, who bore him 8 or 9 children. So she was quite well known in terms of it was a known and open relationship once Thomas Jefferson's wife died, that he fell in love with one of his slaves, and she bore him children, and few of them passed as white and actually went into the community as white folk. And so there was for a long time the African American heritage was split very much from that side of the family as well. So so that's where my grandmother comes from, and then she married my grandfather, who was a full-blooded Frenchman. So that's the background.
And of course, that's where the name Compain comes from, as a French heritage name. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And there's a number of things you talked about there that are familiar to Pacific people, and one is going back to those generations where during the war, and soldiers came across the Pacific, met Pacific partners and had children, and so that there's that children of the war Pacific story. And then also I think fascinating that and have followed that heritage back to the Black American heritage way back in the US. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I tried to see whether it would give me a green card to stay in the US after my scholarship and my university studies. Unfortunately, that didn't extend that far, and I don't think anyone believed me anyway. So.
Yeah, look, I've been lucky in this series talking to a number of people, many of which do have Pacific heritage, and they have similar stories of where they are in life, and then looking back and seeing how they can retrace some of that heritage, because it's starting to become important. So yeah, good that's there. But you'll now know that the Samoan, Tahitian and Fijian teams will be after you to claim heritage for you to come and be involved with them in basketball or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think anyone wants me on the court anymore. My lateral movement's not as good as it used to be.
But growing up was over here in Whanganui, so that's where the family home was, and then it was from there that you started, playing basketball. Was basketball the first sport? And if what was the inspiration?
No, it wasn't actually. And so Whanganui was where my mother took my father because they were living in Auckland around the rest of the family, and they called it the Compain Mafia up in Auckland. And I think my mum was moving, and it was up to my dad whether he was coming or not. he chose wisely, and went with him. So we grew up away from the rest of the extended Compain side of the family, which is probably why where we grew up in a bit more of a European household and a European culture, and very close to both sides, but spent more time growing up with my mum's side of the family. But my grandmother did move down to Wanganui when I was about 8 or 9, so we spent a lot of time when we were younger with her, which was great. But basketball wasn't my first sport. First sport was actually gymnastics. I got into that when I was quite young, and I was decent at it. But at about 10 or 11, realised that I was way too tall. I was never going to get any better. So I was doing that a little bit on the side, just that sort of, died a natural death, and started playing netball as you do. I didn't have another choice really. There wasn't basketball available to us in primary school or even intermediate. And it wasn't until I was in the third form at Wanganui High School that I picked up a basketball, just because my form teacher was the basketball coach. But I had, in talking about family being an inspiration, my cousins from my dad's side came from quite a strong basketball background, and at the time there was a bunch of Compain boys that were playing for Waitakere and North Harbour or North Shore, I think it would have been there. So Tony Compain and Shane Compain and Glenn Compain, and if you ask all the good old, the old boys, the Kenny McFaddens and Antonio Hills and Tony Browns, and those boys all played with them, and they were pretty good for New Zealand ball players. And so they became a little bit of an inspiration, and I started playing because I wanted to be like my cousins. And I remember the first time, this is about 10 years later, and I was playing for New Zealand at a tournament in Auckland, and they all came to the game, and I was so nervous because it's the first time, my cousins and my heroes were watching me play. So that was where the inspiration to play basketball kind of came from.
Yeah, look, I recall, Waitakere, we're right up there amongst the top teams in the local basketball national league as well. Yeah. But at an early age of 16, you went to the US as an exchange student to St. Joseph's Uni in Philadelphia. What was it, leaving Wanganui, and next thing you're in the US amongst this, basketball environment. Yeah.
It's certainly not that unusual now. There's, I think, between 90 to 100 and something odd kids that are, on scholarships in the States now. Yeah. But back then, which was, we're talking a wee while ago now, I can't even do the math. There wasn't that many of us. There was a few of us over there, but there wasn't that many of us. So, and I'd only just started playing basketball a few years earlier, but I was actually at a good old Seventh-day Adventist tournament, back in the days when we used to do that and playing for the churches and things. And I got seen by a Wellington family who had a brother who was living in the States and said, do you want to go over for an exchange, really, into a high school situation? And said, yep, no, I'm into that. I'll get out of here. And went over for, it was only going to be a year, played for a high school team that we did quite well, went to the state championships, and all of a sudden was getting recruited by colleges for to come back on a full scholarship. So 1 year turned into 6 years of schooling, basically 2 years of high school, and then 4 years of a full scholarship at St. Joseph's. And then 6 years turned into another 12, I think it was, before I came home.
Well, you obviously were showing huge talent there. I was just, looking at some of the stats there. It had, for example, after the 4 years that you've left, it had been there 4 to 6 years, you had an 82% accuracy free throw rate. So just to give that some perspective, I did a quick look at Steve Adams is at 60%, and LeBron James is at 75%. So
it's not bad for a big boy, for LeBron.
So and then kind of things being equal, it's at the free throw line. So
it's fair.
So
they've got bigger hands. They always feel like they're shooting tennis balls. I think that's their excuse. So they're not very good.
Pretty impressive, and that was obviously picked up with you being selected for a pro ball contract in the US for the Utah Stars. What was that like? And that was the inaugural Women's National Basketball Association comp.
It was a pretty exactly. It was pretty. I mean, incredible timing through no planning of my own, but to finish that university where college basketball has been strong for a long time, and the equal opportunity under Title IX, I think it is, through the college system, which gives the same amount of scholarships for women as men, was really ahead of its time in terms of equality and opportunity. So the college system's always been really strong for women, and particularly in the main sports like basketball and soccer and things like that. But professional sports in the US didn't exist for women. So there had been a couple of failed experiments at a professional women's league, but it wasn't until the NBA decided to develop the WNBA and put the full might and force and marketing, the expertise of and interest of the NBA behind women's teams and the women's league that it became really successful. So we knew as we were finishing out our college, my final year, my senior year, that the women's NBA was going to be in its inaugural season. So it was an absolute dream to be able to represent, and actually make a team. So I trialed for a few teams. I went to open trials. So I wasn't good enough to be drafted, but they had a draft and then they kept the last 2 spots on every team open. There was only 8 teams. So basically 2 spots across 8 teams, 16 spots with thousands and thousands of girls going for that same opportunity. It was like the American Idol of basketball. You got thrown into a room, into a hall, and you had 3 days to prove yourself in front of thousands of, with thousands of people playing. So for that same spot. So I made the team in Utah and came back, flew out to Utah with my coach, came back and graduated, and then basically got on a plane a couple of days later and ended up in Salt Lake City for 5 months, I think it was, 5 or 6 months.
Fascinating. Hey, look, and you were mentioning how, that American Idol sort of, line up all in the room 3 days and, the last people standing. And then the pathway, like you're saying now, there's a lot of, literally hundreds of New Zealand kids now are able to make scholarships. What's it like for them now entering that pathway? There's still that huge pressure, and they're 100 kids amongst thousands.
I think what makes this time easier for kids is the connectivity. So you think about a 16-year-old kid 20 how many years ago I'm looking at my date on my laptop. I still can't work it out how long ago it was. It was a long time ago, Andre. We had a phone call once a month back home that cost a lot of money, and mum wrote letters every week, and those little blue aero letters that you wrote on both sides and sealed it up and threw. But now you can jump on a FaceTime and a Zoom, Skype calls anytime any time of day, every day of the week. You just feel so much more connected, but the world is so much more open. You know, you can listen to New Zealand music while you're living halfway across the world and feel connected to home and connected to roots. I think that makes it easier in the sense of it's still competitive to get there. The talent, the reason why we've got more people there is because you can see our talent more readily and more easily through you know, scouting tapes and scouting websites, live streaming games, and so you're a lot more connected. I think we probably had the talent back before, but we didn't, you know, we weren't connected. How on earth are you going to see a little, you know, Kiwi girl or boy from Southland playing, even though if they are good enough? So that makes so it's still competitive. They still have to be good enough, and we are, which is what's really exciting about basketball, I think, as a sport. We've got some fantastic talent coming through, men and women, but it does make it a little bit easier to go and stay, because you can, you know, you're connected a lot easier than you were back in the day.
I see that how that is an issue for across many sports when young people are away from home and family, but that is a big thing, having the you know, you can Skype and Zoom and you know, pretty much can catch a plane if you need to get home pretty quickly these days, COVID aside at the moment, but you know, with development and players going up there, there's the likes of Kenny McFadden here in Wellington and his academy, and I understand you had an involvement in your training days with Kenny, and he was, you know, obviously way back then developing young players and bringing them through, and still doing it now. You had an involvement with Kenny as a up and coming player.
I did. I mean, Kenny, you know, take it right back to when we were young kids starting to get interested in basketball, and it was kind of those 80s heyday with all those American imports coming over, and Kenny was one of them, playing for the Saints. And so, you know, I remember being a 12-year-old, 13-year-old looking at those guys and idolizing them like we do LeBron James and Kyrie Irving and all those guys now. And then I went to the States, came back and was training in Wellington, looking to make the Olympic spot for the Sydney Olympics. And I actually ended up having a bad car accident right when I first got home. And I banged myself around quite a bit, and ended up not being able to make the first trial for the New Zealand team. And I had about 6 weeks to try to get myself right and my body back in shape and back aligned and then in shape. And I went to Kenny. I was in Wellington and I went to Kenny and said, "Can you help me?" And I don't think we'd met before, but he knew of me and obviously I knew him. And he just said, "Yep, meet me at 6 o'clock, Les Mills, Taranaki Street." And he then spent about 4 or 5 months with me most mornings in the gym, and then we would meet later on in the afternoon at the courts, and we would just shoot, and he would run me and train me, and it was all for nothing. He did that for nothing. I had nothing to give back to him. So, you know, there's guys like that and people like that you meet along the way who are just completely selfish. My experience with Kenny is that he's completely selfless, and he's doing it for the love of the game. And it's, I'll forever be grateful for him for that.
Well, it's fantastic. He's still doing that now. And, you know, some of the, back in the day in the Saints were playing, you know, just recalling some names for me as a person, they were household names, you know, Kerry Boagny, Angelo Robinson.
Angelo Hill.
And they were entertainers, and the game was entertaining. You know, Frank Mulvihill, all those sort of, you know, big names in the sport. So I think, you know, you did pay back, Kenny, because, you know, you made the Tall Ferns in '98, and then went to 2 Olympics, Sydney and Athens, as you were saying. Tell us about that Olympic, like, kids dream of being Olympians and going to the Olympics. What was it like for you, the journey there and being amongst it?
It was, we always talk about the Sydney Olympics were like a 5-year plan, you know, as we say, where do you want to be in 5 years? We found out in 1995 that New Zealand had a really good chance at being at the Olympics representing us, the basketball side, because Sydney got awarded the games. Our qualification pathway is very difficult when we have to run up against Australia. I think the men have certainly closed the gap between Australia and New Zealand, but the gap between New Zealand and Australia as far as the women's game goes is is pretty significant. You know, they're the
Yeah.
second best team in the world at the best of times, sometimes can be the first best team, you know, the best team in the world. So we knew that a Sydney Olympics meant Australia qualified and New Zealand's got the next best chance. So we needed to play, I think we were scheduled to play American Samoa, who pulled out at the last minute because they couldn't get a team together or funding, so we automatically qualified. And, you know, there was some disappointment in not being able to go through the qualifications process, but I mean, take it for what it is, and we were really excited about it. And we knew that we were working as hard as we possibly could in a semi-professional and sometimes in an amateur environment to get our team into the best position possible to play for, you know, represent New Zealand and play in Sydney. Having the game so close to home was pretty special as well, because it did feel like almost a home Olympics. You know, the stadium was often full with Kiwi supporters, and it was just a once in a life. Well, what we thought was going to be a once in a lifetime opportunity to then hear that we had the same opportunity to get to qualify for Athens 4 years later. Was just mind-blowing. So I'd retired. Quite a few of us had stopped playing basketball because that was it. You know, 5 years building up to all our life decisions were made around representing New Zealand at the Sydney Olympics. So a lot of us, you know, dipped out after that and started to try to think about what our professional life was going to be like and try to, you know, to move on, what was next. And then we found out that we qualified for Athens. So yeah, I came out of retirement, took a good 12 months to get fit, a little bit older. And we obviously had, we had a much better showing in Athens than we did in Sydney. So 4 years on, 4 years more mature, 4 years probably a little bit older and just more savvy, like smarter, not nearly as athletic and probably as young and fit, but we were just a lot smarter of a team, and we did really well. We beat China and Korea in pool play and went to the quarterfinals, which was our goal, and a really a goal that not a lot of the Olympic supporters or backers thought was possible. So we were really pleased with that.
I think that's incredible, especially backing up. After you said after the 2000 and maybe had made other plans, and next thing you're out, you know, having to do those shuttle runs again, and you start learning where the shortcuts are on them.
The good old Broncos,
But well, look, there's a really important point there you mentioned about you know, it's the women's team, and you start making plans around either being in and preparing or not. And you know, there are obviously other commitments, challenges that women and people have if they're going to be parents, and then put that on hold. And there are a lot of other kinds of challenges that in particular will face women compared to men in sport. So just be interesting to move on to, like, you were involved with a project which was the New Zealand Olympic Committee Women in Sport program. And yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about that, what that program was about, and then kind of some of the challenges that are there for women in sport.
Yeah, that was really, I think it was an incredibly inspirational group of women to be involved with, as the New Zealand Olympic Committee started that program called Women in Sport, looking at bringing high-performing female sportswomen into environment together to understand how you, create those opportunities not outside of sport necessarily, but outside of the participation in sport, the athletic side of it. So there is, in our group, we had a mix of women who were still in sport in various coaching or high performance or governance roles, but also some other women that have gone into, you know, professional pathways of a lot of lawyers, physiotherapists, you know, in a commercial marketing environment. But it was almost an opportunity to step back and say, well, what do we all have in common, and what is our strength, and how do we actually support a movement to get more women involved in sport participation level on through into governance, coaching, high performance, etc. Because there seems to be that pathway or that opportunity or that desire or even the understanding or willingness that it's there or available to us to continue to be effective leaders in sport. I think we participate in sport well, but we step back when it comes to leadership, and that was an opportunity for us to step forward, to have our voices heard. Having the backing of the New Zealand Olympic Committee just gave it that real impetus to and visibility, because it had some real meaning, and it got us in front of the Minister of Sport. It got us in front of all the influential men and women that are involved in the governance, Sport New Zealand, High Performance Sport New Zealand, etc., and the media and things like that. So I think that was, you know, I don't want to be as cheesy and cliche to say life-changing, but it was a real highlight of the last few years to just take a step back from your everyday life and just battling away in your day-to-day and see whether or not there's something more that I could be doing to better the opportunities for people that will come after me.
And what are some of the things that you're seeing or that you might have picked up that we need to do more of?
Well, we had a group in the bigger group. We were all pulled into smaller groups, and one of the challenges that we were asked to review and report on and try to come up with some solutions or some ideas for was the visibility of women in sport. So particularly looking at it from a media perspective, and the quality and the quantity of media reporting as it comes to women athletes, female athletes and female sports, which has not bettered in the last 20 years, and it hasn't really even improved in the last 4 or 5 years with such an emphasis on the Me Too movement and equality and diversity, etc. So it raised a really interesting opportunity for us as well to say, well, what are we actually doing? In me personally, am I reading women's sports articles? Am I querying why am I not seeing more about the Tall Ferns playing? Am I following enough social media accounts? So it made me have a little bit of an inward look to say, what more can I be doing? And just by raising my awareness and lifting your head up a little bit, even just opportunities like this come along, to talk to you about, and we've worked together, thankfully, and I'm really pleased and love the opportunity that we got to work with each other in our commercial or professional life, but that these opportunities to come up and talk about the importance of being role models and telling your stories, so that they can be heard and they can maybe potentially someone might get a little bit inspired by it, or at least it's visible. They might get annoyed, roll their eyes and turn it off, but at least you've made an impression. So we actually took that support women's sport idea a little bit further than probably our group expected us to. But I've got the benefit of having a creative husband who works for owns a creative industry agency here in Wellington, and I'll do a plug. It's called 81. But they gave up time, resource, money to basically build a campaign that about the idea of supporting women's sport and to raise the awareness and the visibility. And we took on this. I don't know whether you saw it. The idea around renaming the Basin Reserve. Which in all reality was a publicity stunt. And I think it was Mike Hosking got it, because I stupidly was reading all the Facebook messages at 2:00 in the morning one night when my little one was up, and you're reading all these comments and who the hell is this person? What an idiot! What is she talking about? Who the hell does she think this is just ridiculous? And just all those negative social media comments. And Mike Hosking got it. He said, the opportunity or chance to rename the Basin Reserve was probably never really what it was all about. What it was about was to get people talking and to get people like me with a medium to start reporting on the importance of us highlighting our women athletes and our female competitors and giving them a voice and giving them a platform. So
no, that's right. I think you would have raised the ire of many a cucumber sandwich and cup of tea on the green if we're going to change the name of the Basin Reserve. But some of the things that are there now that are opportunities are exactly like this. And with social media, we don't necessarily have to rely on the old school reporters and journalists. With a bit of finesse and putting things together, you can drive your campaigns and put your campaigns together some good experience. So look, you mentioned us working on some projects together through the commercial world. So you're the head of commercial at New Zealand Rugby. So look, it'd be good to just have a quick insight into the work you're doing there, and maybe what are some of the positive developments that New Zealand Rugby are doing around diversity and women in rugby?
Yeah, so I look after a team of about 6 of us at the moment. We've just gone through a pretty painful restructure in light of COVID, which has been really tough on all sports industries, and we're no different. Even though rugby sits in a pretty privileged position, the impacts of COVID has been felt pretty significantly. But my core role is to look after the commercial partnerships that bring in income into New Zealand Rugby, and that's through sponsorship or license agreements through our teams in black and our competitions, Super Rugby, Mitre 10 Cup and Wharapama Cup, etc. So all in all, it's about, I think last count was about $65 million worth of revenue per annum that we're responsible for. So we look after the contract delivery, marketing campaigns, your player activations, and all those sorts of things to keep partners happy, and with the intent that they sign on and stay with us. So our team also looks after our charitable initiatives as well, and some of the highlights of my career were some of the UNICEF events that we did around the world with the great UNICEF team, especially in Argentina and Japan, was fantastic. So I quite like the opportunity to get the philanthropic side of the commercial side balanced as well. But probably, to your point out, what's the key changes or things that have been quite different in the last few years has certainly been our partners being much more aware and wanting their partnership to show or to give a platform for diversity and inclusion. So I think AIG probably have done that the best with a few of the campaigns that we work directly with, in terms of that Diversity is Strength campaign that we shot in Japan, and Effort is Effort, which is a campaign that they shot with the All Blacks and Black Ferns, basically showing the exact same exact same physical movements and physical attributions of the men and the women, but also the amount of partners that have started to want women and the Black Ferns and the Black Fern Sevens in their asset rights. So, of course, the All Blacks often are the front door and the hero piece, but more and more brands are wanting the women to also be able to activate, to market, to speak directly to products, and not just speaking to diversity, but to actually leverage their products, but also to show that their brands are looking at the importance and relevance of women in sport. I think Adidas is probably, like most sports brands, is one of the ones that are bringing that to the fore as well. I think they've got, whereas maybe 4 years ago they didn't have any, or maybe 1 or 2 women athletes on individual contracts. Now they've got about 20. So, and long may it continue.
And it's great to see those partners of yours, Adidas and AIG, really commit to that, hey? And obviously New Zealand Rugby, they're a household name and carry a lot of ability to make change. So if we're making impacts around diversity, around voice, woman voice, ethnic voice, New Zealand Rugby is certainly a good place and doing a good job with that. Megan, I just want to thank you for your time in this Wahine Toa Women in Sport. Talanoa, kōrero. Been fascinating learning about your heritage, that very mixed across the Pacific to the US and to France. This is an astounding stat, 82%, and some of the big names, and then getting through to to the Olympics and the work that you've been doing to promote diversity and voice for women through the New Zealand Olympic Committee Women in Sport program. So been awesome talking to you, and thank you very much, and wish you all the best.
Awesome. Kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Thanks, Andre.